the German army inserted nails into the prisoners' fingers to extract information about the escapees' whereabouts, and forced them into sub-zero seawater to test how long they could endure. Such brutal treatment of these Norwegian prisoners was solely to capture the missing 12th man. During World War II, the British trained 12 Norwegians and sent them to Norway to carry out an explosive mission, known as Operation Red Martin. However, upon reaching the Norwegian border, they found the area swarming with German naval vessels, making it impossible to approach. As a result, Jan Balesrud and another person contacted a liaison. The original liaison had been sacrificed, and the new one was a traitor. As soon as they left, the traitor immediately called the German army, resulting in a warship sailed directly in front of the small boat. The 12 Norwegians made a futile resistance, as continuing to fight meant destruction and death for all. Therefore, Jan Balesrud instructed everyone to abandon ship. He ignited the explosives on board, hoping to destroy all operational evidence and secret documents. After the explosion, everyone struggled to swim to shore under German gunfire. Upon reaching the shore, Jan Balesrud and his teammate hid behind a rock. The other 10 had been captured by the Germans one after another. The only remaining Jan Balesrud saw the document bag. The Germans fished it out just as they had the idea to go and get it. The soldiers handed him over to the officer, who began interrogating the prisoners. At that moment, Jan Balesrud seized the opportunity to run up the mountain. Seeing this, the officer immediately ordered a pursuit. Jan Balesrud hid behind a rock, quickly took out his frozen pistol, and knocked off the ice on the rock to successfully load it. Choosing the right moment, Jan Balesrud turned around, knocked down a soldier, and did not dare to delay a second longer, continuing to flee. The pursuing German soldiers aimed their rifles and shot Jan Balesrud in the toe, with his blood serving as the perfect trail. Despite this, Jan Balesrud did not stop. He confused his tracks and bloodstains by the lake, temporarily preventing the Germans from continuing their pursuit. Taking advantage of this time gap, Jan Balesrud managed to get to the beach at Toft Fjord. At night, having gained a moment to breathe, Jan Balesrud quickly checked his injuries and put his only sock on his right foot. Suddenly, the German army fired several flares into the sky. They had not given up the search for Jan Balesrud. In the illuminated darkness, he became completely exposed, with nowhere to hide. He had no choice but to bravely enter the sea. When his life was threatened, not even the cold seawater could stop his desire to survive. The German officer personally felt the water temperature and deduced that a normal person could not stay in such cold seawater for too long. However, Jan Balesrud had already swum to the opposite shore, gasping for air on the beach and temporarily escaping the German manhunt. Frozen solid, Jan Balesrud spotted a small boat. Because they were all Norwegians, the two people on the boat did not ignore him. They took Jan Balesrud back to their home. At this time, the German forces were still firing flares on the opposite shore. This was the crucial time difference Jan Balesrud desperately won, while his companions were all captured by the Germans. While examining the document bag, Kurt Stage asked a translator to sort through the damaged documents. He then found personnel information cards and, after comparison, plus those executed by firing squad, there should have been 12 people in total. However, there was clearly one missing. Upon inquiry, it was revealed that Eric Reichelt had assumed the injured Jan Balesrud's near-sea condition meant certain death, so he did not continue the pursuit. For Kurt Stage, he demanded to see the person alive or the body if dead. A disappearance meant the person was still alive, so they were determined to find him, even if it meant searching every inch of the ground. On the small boat, Jan Balesrud was taken to a doctor's house by the people who rescued him. Upon landing, Jan Balesrud approached the house cautiously. The elderly woman was startled by his appearance and mentioned that her husband was not home. However, seeing Jan Balesrud limping, she still helped bandage him. The woman, who had previously worked as a midwife, informed Jan Balesrud that his wound had festered and required immediate medical attention, or it would be life-threatening. Jan Balesrud, pulling out a map, expressed his desire to return to his previous location to rescue his teammates. Suddenly, the elderly woman heard noises. It was the German army coming to inspect. Looking for the injured Jan Balesrud, the first places they inspected were the homes of medical practitioners. Fortunately, the inspection was not thorough, and they managed to escape through the back door. On the other side, Kurt Stage had translated the documents and learned about Operation Red Martin. However, without finding the missing 12th person, the matter was considered unresolved. Meanwhile, Jan Balesrud followed the coastline, walking through mountains and across snow, until he finally found the house the elderly woman had directed him to. The homeowner's daughter had been delivered by the elderly woman. The family was kind and friendly. Seeing Jan Balesrud's injured toes, the woman immediately disinfected his wounds. For more effective treatment, Jan Balesrud needed to go to the hospital. However, Jan Balesrud was well aware that going to the hospital would be walking into a trap, as the other captured teammates were at the hospital where the woman worked. She informed Jan Balesrud that the rest of his team would be executed that night, a piece of news that devastated him. As he wept in sorrow, a little girl gave him a map she had drawn, hoping it would help Jan Balesrud escape his current predicament. Since he could not save his teammates, he must find a way to escape from the clutches of the German forces. Sweden, as a neutral country, meant survival for Jan Balesrud if he could cross the border from Norway. The Norwegian comrades who had carried out the mission with him had all been tortured, yet not one had confessed. After enduring endless torment, they were eventually lined up in front of a prepared mass grave.
Gud signe vårt dyre fedreland, og la det som hagen bløma. Lat lysa din fred på fjell som kristne.
By morning, Jan Balesrud by the riverside tore off the signature the little girl had drawn, ensuring that if he met with misfortune, it wouldn't bring trouble to the family that had helped him. Then, he found a boatman. With the boatman's assistance, they set off towards Sweden in a boat. By this time, his foot condition had worsened significantly, and there was still a long journey ahead, but the boat could only take him part of the way. As they neared the shore, the boatman jumped into the bone-chilling sea, then took over the skis and hoisted Jan Balesrud onto his shoulders, carrying him step by step towards the border. Keeping Jan Balesrud alive was a beacon of hope for Norway, a nation under occupation. Landing ashore, Jan Balesrud strapped on the skis, ready to cross the ridges towards Sweden, but his path of thorns was just beginning. In the vast white snow, Jan Balesrud was lonely in his search for an escape route. Passing a German military base, with nowhere else to go, he had to steel himself to cross. Unexpectedly, he fell to the ground. Watching Jan Balesrud leave, Kurt Stage was about to return indoors but stopped at the door as a thought suddenly struck him. Jan Balesrud, having narrowly escaped the base, hadn't gone far when he saw a plane roaring overhead. Clearly, Kurt Stage had sent it to hunt him down, because only the escaped 12th man would dare to take the mountainous route. Jan Balesrud, not killed by the plane, was swept into the woods by an avalanche. Though he didn't die, the forceful impact felt like it had shattered his body, and the churning in his stomach made him vomit. After screaming in pain, he managed to crawl out of the snow pit using the strength of his arms alone. Knowing the Germans would come back to look for the body, he understood that as long as he had a breath left in him, he needed to keep moving forward. Sure enough, the German troops soon arrived at the scene. They found the broken skis and backpack but no trace of Jan Balesrud himself. Severely injured, Jan Balesrud, hanging onto his last breath, pushed himself to go further. Crossing a small river, he was no different from a walking corpse, his legs completely encased in ice. At the forefront of his path was a Norwegian household. The man in charge of the interrogation was a Norwegian, and Marius Grunwald said impatiently that no stranger had ever been here before. With the entire city being searched by the German forces, everyone knew that the escaped 12th man was a Norwegian hero. So, compared to the traitor standing opposite him, Marius Grunwald felt a strong disdain. While talking to the German soldiers, Marius suddenly spotted a figure in the distant woods. It was Jan Balesrud. As the German search was drawing to a close, Marius Grunwald quickly coped with a few words and dismissed the soldiers. After ensuring everyone had left, he and his sister hurriedly went to look for Jan Balesrud. Sending the children outside, Marius and his sister began to assess Jan Balesrud's injuries. Seeing the horrific condition of his feet, they could hardly imagine how he had endured. After administering first aid, Jan Balesrud once again escaped death's grasp. The German forces brought back the drawing from Jan Balesrud's backpack that the little girl had made. Since the signature had been torn off, Kurt Stage had no idea who had drawn it, but he was certain that if Jan Balesrud wanted to survive, he would seek help at a farm near the avalanche. Under the care of Gudrun Granvoll, Jan Balesrud woke up after being unconscious for several days. Before they could exchange a few words, they heard the sound of a car engine. Jan Balesrud immediately asked for a handgun, while Gudrun Granvoll ran outside at once. This time, Kurt Stage led the team personally, planning to search the nearby farms again. He went straight into the barn, while Jan Balesrud, armed with a gun, hid behind a pile of hay on the second floor. Gudrun Granvoll was extremely nervous outside. As Kurt Stage was about to climb to the second floor, the badge on his collar got caught. After a brief glance and noticing nothing unusual, Kurt Stage jumped down and hurriedly picked up his badge from the hay. The search was fruitless again. A disappointed Kurt Stage got into the car headed for the next farm. Once the German troops had all left, Marius Granville quickly carried Jan Balesrud out. It was too dangerous to stay any longer, as they would eventually be discovered. Therefore, he took Jan Balesrud to a small cabin in the mountains, leaving him with candles, sweet potatoes, and a bottle of wine to ward off the cold. He told Jan Balesrud to rest for a few days and promised to find a way to get him to Sweden. After Marius Granville left, the pain from his foot injury led Jan Balesrud into a breakdown. The dual torment of mind and body caused his mental state to deteriorate, haunted by constant nightmares and struggles. Finally, unable to endure any longer, Jan Balesrud removed his sock. He used a knife to cut open the bandages, and the moment he did, a foul smell hit him. The area near his big toe had completely necrotized. Jan Balesrud took a swig of wine, then stuffed a handkerchief into his mouth. He had to amputate the necrotic parts himself. After cutting off the first toe, Jan Balesrud was sweating profusely from the pain. He took another drink of wine and had to endure the excruciating pain as he cut off the second toe. Having experienced agonizing pain, Jan Balesrud took the blackened toes and stuffed them into a crevice in the wall. After a rudimentary bandaging, he passed out completely. When Marius Granville and others returned to the cabin, it was 12 days later. Learning that Jan Balesrud had amputated his toes, they didn't know how to describe the tormented man before them. They placed him at the doorway and began assembling the sled Marius Granville had made. They tied Jan Balesrud to it and, using manpower, pulled him up the snowy mountain. Marius Granville had arranged for people to meet them, planning to pass Jan Balesrud along in a relay to the border. The journey was anything but easy. They had to avoid German patrols and monitor Jan Balesrud's condition. They could only travel by day to avoid suspicion if the Germans found the farms deserted. Thus, Marius Granville and others had no choice but to place Jan Balesrud in a crevice between rocks, letting him endure the night alone. The next day, someone else would take over and move him. For Jan Balesrud, every minute of the night was torture. If not for his strong will to live, he would have died long ago. On the fourth day, Marius Granville told his sister that by this time, Jan Balesrud should have reached Sweden. Unexpectedly, the person responsible for the next part of the relay came back, saying he hadn't seen Jan Balesrud at the designated spot. After checking the coordinates, they realized the mistake was made in the meeting point. After 4 days, Jan Balesrud could very well have turned into a frozen corpse. Thus, Marius Granville hurriedly led a search up the mountain. After uncovering the snow that had sealed the hiding spot behind a boulder, they found Jan Balesrud inside. Seemingly breathless, Marius Granville felt a profound sense of guilt. Just then, Jan Balesrud slowly opened his eyes. The two quickly dug him out, and Gudrun Granville replenished Jan Balesrud with some water and food, while Marius Granville remarked the position of the rocks. With optimism and resilience, Jan Balesrud kept the flickering flame of life shining in the darkness of despair. After this replenishment, he had to continue lying under the rock waiting for the next part of the relay, which took another 6 days. The people meant to meet him were delayed by a blizzard, which was the fastest they could manage, including the 10 days lying under the rock. It had now been 36 days since Jan Balesrud started his escape. In this desperate relay for life, there wasn't a single stage that wasn't perilous. The continuous blizzards not only delayed the rendezvous but also blocked their return path. With no choice left, Jan Balesrud was placed in a cave. They were still a distance from Sweden, but aside from the blizzard, the Swedish border was heavily guarded by German troops, making any attempt to cross suicidal. Thus, without a secure method of transfer, he had to wait. During this waiting period, different Norwegians came in batches and at different times to visit the injured Jan Balesrud. Some looked after his feet, others brought him food. Though these changing faces did not attract German attention, with the passage of time and the melting snow, it soon would be impossible to transport Jan Balesrud across the border. Therefore, Marius Granville took Jan Balesrud to a pasture, where the sled was tied to reindeer. If a large herd of reindeer could rush across the border, Jan Balesrud could follow them, presenting his only chance at escape. At that moment in the pasture, Gudrun Granville suddenly remembered giving Jan Balesrud a handkerchief with her name on it. If the Germans found the cabin, she would be implicated. Thus, the siblings hurried to clean up the cabin. However, upon arriving at the cabin and before they could conduct a thorough check, they encountered German troops. Soon, Kurt Stage also arrived at the cabin by plane, and the siblings were held on the spot. Kurt Stage quickly found the toes that Jan Balesrud had amputated in a crevice of the cabin's wall. Along with evidence, there was little for the siblings to say. Kurt Stage refrained from killing them, instead aiming to extract information about Jan Balesrud's current whereabouts. He had already reported to Berlin that all 12 men were captured and executed. However, if Jan Balesrud managed to leave Norway alive, it would be considered an act of deceit against the state. Meanwhile, As the herd of reindeer sprinted rapidly, Jan Balesrud embarked on a new journey of survival. Completely bound, he left his fate to chance. The German border guards, observing the large group of animals charging through, watched curiously, unable to discern that a man was hidden among them. In those tense minutes, Jan Balesrud once again faced despair. His body was thoroughly wounded. Relying solely on his remaining willpower, he flipped the sled over and quickly removed his gloves to frantically shift his position by sliding on his arms across the snow. In the open snow, he was an easy target. Fortunately, he slid down a slope before the German troops could fire, merely delaying his inevitable capture. Several German soldiers approached, and Jan Balesrud's pistol had only one bullet left, intended for himself. Seeing the reindeer return, Jan Balesrud knew he wasn't fated to die yet. Taking the chance before the German troops could reach him, he quickly tied the rope to the reindeer, leaving his fate to the heavens. Thus, he successfully crossed into Swedish territory. This race against death finally ended in victory for Jan Balesrud. Back at the cabin, Kurt Stage received a call with the news. Facing failure and unsure of how to proceed, Kurt Stage walked slowly into the sea. 3 months later, the rejuvenated Jan Balesrud was gradually recovering, holding the rewritten documentation of Operation Red Martin in his hands. Reflecting on his hellish ordeal, Jan Balesrud slowly turned and walked with a limp to the captain, handing over the documents before receiving his own military cap. Despite all hardships, Jan Balesrud never gave up the fight. He continued to serve in the military, training new soldiers until Norway was liberated. This story is adapted from true events. The Marius Granvoll siblings escaped execution by the German forces. Kurt Stage was executed in 1947 for war crimes. Jan Balesrud has said he is not the hero. The real heroes are those who helped him. I'm a movie enthusiast, and I welcome you to subscribe to my channel. See you in the next episode.